The conference room fell silent as the CFO slammed his laptop shut. Annabelle, these numbers you're presenting are completely useless. We don't have time for theoretical analysis when we're trying to save this company. 3 months later, that same CFO was clearing out his office, along with half the executive team, because the board had used those exact useless metrics to expose the largest financial cover-up in the company's history. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Annabelle Martinez had always been the type of person who saw patterns where others saw chaos. As a data analyst at Pinnacle Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company based in Denver, she spent her days buried in spreadsheets that most people would find mind-numbing. But to Annabelle, each number told a story, and lately, those stories weren't adding up. It was a Tuesday morning in September when she first noticed something odd. She was reviewing the quarterly expense reports, a routine task she'd done dozens of times before, when a particular set of numbers caught her attention. The consulting fees for the third quarter showed a pattern that didn't match anything she'd seen in her 4 years at the company. Pinnacle Industries manufactured specialized industrial equipment, primarily for the construction and mining sectors. The company had been family-owned for 30 years before going public 5 years ago, and with that transition came new pressures for growth and profitability. The executive team, led by CEO Richard Thornfield, had been aggressively pursuing expansion into international markets. Annabelle's cubicle sat in the corner of the finance department, overlooking the parking lot where she could watch employees come and go. She preferred the anonymity of her position, close enough to the action to understand the business, but far enough removed to avoid the politics that seemed to consume the executive floors above. The consulting fees that caught her attention weren't huge in absolute terms, but they appeared with suspicious regularity. Every month, payments were made to 3 different consulting firms: Strategic Dynamics LLC, Pinnacle Advisory Services, and Mountain Peak Consulting. What struck her as odd wasn't the existence of these payments, but their timing and amounts. Each payment was just under the threshold that would require additional board approval, exactly $24,900, when the limit was $25,000. The payments were made on the same day each month, usually the 15th, and they'd been going on for over 2 years. When Annabelle tried to trace the payments back to specific projects or deliverables, she hit dead ends. Strategic Dynamics LLC claimed to provide market analysis and competitive intelligence. Pinnacle Advisory Services was listed as offering organizational development and strategic planning. Mountain Peak Consulting supposedly handled, quote, risk assessment and operational efficiency studies. Yet when Annabelle searched through the company's shared drives and project management systems, she couldn't find a single report, presentation, or deliverable from any of these firms. Her first instinct was to bring this to her immediate supervisor, Janet Walsh, the assistant finance director. Janet was a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who had worked her way up from an entry-level accounting position. She had always been supportive of Annabelle's analytical approach and had even encouraged her to pursue additional certifications in data analysis. "Janet, I've been looking at our consulting expenses and I'm seeing some patterns that seem unusual," Annabelle said, settling into the chair across from Janet's desk with a printed copy of her analysis. Janet looked up from her computer screen, adjusting her reading glasses. "What kind of patterns?" Annabelle spread out the papers, pointing to the highlighted sections. "These 3 consulting firms have been receiving monthly payments for over 2 years. Same amount, same timing, but I can't find any work product or documentation of what they're actually doing for us." Janet frowned as she examined the numbers. "That is odd. Have you checked with procurement to see if there are contracts on file?" "That was my next step, but I wanted to run it by you first. The amounts are significant when you add them up. We're talking about nearly $900,000 annually going to these 3 firms. Definitely worth investigating. Go ahead and reach out to procurement, and also check with the legal department to see if they have copies of any consulting agreements. This could be perfectly legitimate, but it's good that you're asking questions." Armed with Janet's approval, Annabelle began digging deeper. Her first stop was the procurement department, housed on the second floor in a maze of cubicles that somehow managed to feel even more cramped than her own workspace. She found Marcus Thompson, the procurement manager, hunched over his computer with what appeared to be multiple vendor databases open simultaneously. Marcus was known throughout the company as someone who knew where every penny went. If there was a contract, purchase order, or vendor agreement, Marcus either had it filed away or could tell you exactly where to find it. His reputation for thoroughness made him both respected and occasionally feared by department managers who were used to more casual spending approvals. "Marcus, I'm hoping you can help me track down some consulting contracts," Annabelle said, pulling up a chair next to his desk. "I'm seeing regular payments to 3 firms, but I can't find the supporting documentation." Marcus turned from his screen, immediately interested. "Which firms?" "Strategic Dynamics, Pinnacle Advisory Services, and Mountain Peak Consulting. Monthly payments of $24,900 each, going back about 2 years. Marcus's expression shifted from interested to concerned. "Those names don't ring a bell, and trust me, I would remember consulting agreements of that size. Monthly payments would definitely require procurement involvement, especially at those amounts." He turned to his computer and began typing rapidly. After several minutes of searching through various databases, he shook his head. "I'm not finding any active contracts with those firms. No RFPs, no vendor onboarding paperwork, no insurance certificates, nothing. These payments are being processed without going through normal procurement channels." "Is that unusual?" "Highly unusual. The only way payments like this could bypass procurement would be if they were approved directly by the executive team and processed as emergency or exceptional expenses. But even then, there should be documentation." Annabelle felt a familiar tingle of excitement that she always got when data revealed hidden patterns. Who would have the authority to approve payments like this without normal procurement processes? Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering the question carefully. The CEO could do it, obviously. The CFO could as well. Maybe the COO in certain circumstances. But honestly, Annabelle, in my 8 years here, I've never seen regular monthly payments processed this way. Emergency expenses, sure, but not ongoing consulting arrangements. Her next stop was the legal department, where she hoped to find contracts or agreements that might explain the payments. The legal department at Pinnacle consisted of just 3 people: General Counsel Patricia Hayes, Associate Counsel David Kim, and legal assistant Sarah Rodriguez. Patricia Hayes had joined Pinnacle 2 years earlier, brought in from a larger corporation to help navigate the complexities of being a publicly traded company. She had a reputation for being thorough and direct, qualities that had served her well in cleaning up various compliance issues left over from the company's transition from private to public ownership. "Patricia, I'm doing some analysis on our consulting expenses, and I'm hoping you might have contracts on file for 3 firms we've been paying regularly," Annabelle explained, once again spreading out her printed analysis. Patricia examined the documents with the careful attention of someone trained to spot problems. "Strategic Dynamics, Pinnacle Advisory Services, and Mountain Peak Consulting," she read aloud. "I don't recall seeing contracts for any of these firms. David handles most of our consulting agreements. Let me check with him." David Kim emerged from his office, a stack of documents in hand. He was relatively new to Pinnacle, having joined about 18 months earlier as Patricia's first hire. His background was in corporate law, with particular expertise in contract negotiation and vendor management. "David, do we have consulting agreements with any of these 3 firms?" Patricia asked, showing him Annabelle's analysis. David studied the names and shook his head. "No, I would definitely remember these. I've reviewed all our active consulting agreements, and these aren't among them. Are you sure these are legitimate business expenses?" The question hung in the air, and Annabelle realized that what had started as a routine data analysis was beginning to look like something much more serious. "The payments are definitely being made. I can see them in our financial systems. But procurement doesn't have contracts, and legal doesn't have agreements. So how are these payments being approved?" Patricia's expression had shifted into what Annabelle recognized as lawyer mode: careful, analytical, and slightly protective. "This needs to be escalated. Regular payments of this magnitude without proper documentation represent a significant compliance risk. We need to understand how these are being processed and who's authorizing them." "What's the next step?" Annabelle asked. I think you need to take this to finance leadership, probably directly to the CFO. This isn't something that should stay at the analyst level. But Annabelle, I want you to be careful about how you present this. There could be legitimate explanations we're not seeing, and making accusations without complete information could be problematic. That afternoon, Annabelle found herself back at Janet's desk, this time with a much more concerning story to tell. Janet listened intently as Annabelle described her conversations with procurement and legal. So we have nearly $900,000 in annual payments going to firms that procurement has never heard of, legal has no contracts for, and we can't find any work product from, Janet summarized. That's definitely something we need to escalate, Patricia suggested, taking it directly to the CFO. Janet nodded slowly. I think that's right. But let's make sure we have all our facts straight first. Can you put together a comprehensive analysis showing the payment patterns, the lack of documentation, and what you've found in your investigation so far? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Annabelle spent the next 2 days creating what she considered to be one of her most thorough analyses ever. She documented every payment, created timeline charts showing the suspicious regularity, and included screenshots of her searches through company systems showing the absence of any related work product. She cross-referenced the payments with major company projects and events, looking for any correlation that might explain the timing or amounts. What she found was even more troubling than the original discovery. The payments had begun shortly after Richard Thornfield became CEO, and they'd increased in frequency and amount over time. More concerning, the payments seemed to increase during quarters when the company was under pressure to meet earnings targets. The analysis also revealed something else interesting. The 3 consulting firms all had addresses in Delaware, but when Annabelle tried to research them online, she found minimal web presence. Strategic Dynamics had a basic website with stock photos and generic language about business consulting. Pinnacle Advisory Services had no website at all, just a listing in an online business directory. Mountain Peak Consulting's website hadn't been updated in over a year and contained no information about actual services or clients. Armed with her comprehensive analysis, Annabelle scheduled a meeting with CFO Michael Davidson. Davidson had been with Pinnacle for 3 years, brought in during the public transition to help establish more sophisticated financial controls and reporting. He had a reputation for being data-driven and analytical, which gave Annabelle hope that he would appreciate the thoroughness of her investigation. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in Davidson's office on the executive floor, a level of the building that Annabelle rarely visited. The executive floor had a different feel entirely from the working floors below. The carpets were thicker, the lighting softer, and the offices were actual offices with doors and windows, not the cubicle maze that housed most employees. Davidson's office overlooked the company's manufacturing facility, where Annabelle could see workers moving between buildings and forklifts transporting materials. The contrast between the executive floor's quiet elegance and the industrial activity visible through the windows struck her as emblematic of the distance between leadership and operations. Annabelle, Janet tells me you've been doing some interesting analysis of our consulting expenses, Davidson said, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his desk. What have you found? Annabelle launched into her presentation, walking through each element of her analysis methodically. She explained the payment patterns, the lack of documentation, the absence of work product, and the suspicious timing. Davidson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification on specific points. When she finished, Davidson sat quietly for several moments, studying the documents spread across his desk. Finally, he looked up with an expression that Annabelle couldn't quite read. This is very thorough work, Annabelle, but I think you may be overanalyzing some routine business expenses. These consulting arrangements were put in place before my time here, and they serve important strategic purposes that might not be immediately obvious to someone outside the executive team. Annabelle felt a flutter of uncertainty. But the lack of documentation from procurement and legal. Not every business arrangement follows the same processes. When you're dealing with sensitive strategic consulting, market intelligence, competitive analysis, confidential planning, sometimes discretion is more important than bureaucratic paperwork. The explanation felt unsatisfying, but Davidson's confidence made Annabelle question her own analysis. Should I be concerned about the compliance implications? Patricia in legal seemed to think the lack of contracts was problematic. Davidson's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. Annabelle, I appreciate your diligence, but I need you to understand something. These kinds of strategic consulting arrangements are common in our industry, and they're handled at the executive level for good reasons. Spreading concerns about their legitimacy could create unnecessary confusion and potentially harm important business relationships. I understand, but… Let me be clear, Davidson interrupted. These payments are legitimate business expenses, properly approved through appropriate channels. Your analysis, while thorough, is based on incomplete information because you don't have access to the strategic context that drives these decisions. I'm going to ask you to discontinue this line of investigation and focus on your assigned responsibilities. Annabelle left the meeting feeling deflated and confused. Everything in her analysis pointed to irregularities that warranted further investigation, but the CFO had dismissed her concerns and essentially ordered her to drop the matter. She wondered if she had misunderstood something fundamental about how business worked at the executive level. But as she rode the elevator back down to her floor, one detail from the meeting stuck with her. Davidson had said the consulting arrangements were put in place before his time at the company, but her analysis clearly showed that the payments had begun after he joined. Either he was mistaken about the timeline, or he wasn't being entirely truthful about his knowledge of the arrangements. That weekend, Annabelle found herself unable to stop thinking about the discrepancy. She had always prided herself on the accuracy of her data analysis, and she was confident in her timeline. The payments had definitely begun after Davidson's arrival at Pinnacle. So why would he claim they predated his tenure? By Monday morning, she had made a decision. Despite Davidson's directive to drop the investigation, she couldn't ignore what appeared to be a significant misstatement from the company's chief financial officer. She needed to understand what was really happening, even if it meant proceeding carefully and quietly. Temporary, her first step was to verify her timeline analysis one more time. She pulled up the employee directory and confirmed Davidson's start date, then cross-referenced it with the first payments to the consulting firms. There was no question. The payments had begun 3 months after Davidson joined the company. This discrepancy transformed what had seemed like a routine compliance issue into something potentially much more serious. If the CFO was being less than truthful about his knowledge of these payments, it suggested the possibility of deliberate deception rather than simple oversight. Annabelle decided to approach her investigation differently this time. Instead of working through official channels, she would focus on publicly available information and company records that didn't require special access. She started by researching the 3 consulting firms more thoroughly, using advanced search techniques she'd learned in her data analytics training. What she discovered was even more troubling than she'd expected. Strategic Dynamics LLC had been incorporated in Delaware just 2 weeks before the first payment from Pinnacle Industries. The incorporation documents, available through the Delaware Division of Corporations website, listed the registered agent as a corporate services company that specialized in providing anonymous business formations. Pinnacle Advisory Services showed a similar pattern, incorporated in Delaware shortly before receiving its first payment, with the same registered agent. Mountain Peak Consulting had a slightly different structure, incorporated in Nevada, but with equally opaque ownership information. The more Annabelle dug, the more suspicious the entire arrangement became. These weren't established consulting firms with track records and reputations. They appeared to be shell companies created specifically to receive payments from Pinnacle Industries. Her breakthrough came when she decided to analyze the bank routing numbers associated with the payments. This information was available in the accounts payable system, though it required some creative searching to access. What she found made her stomach drop. All 3 consulting firms were receiving payments at the same bank, a small regional bank in Wyoming that specialized in serving businesses seeking privacy and minimal reporting requirements. More damning, the account numbers were sequential, suggesting they'd been opened at the same time by the same person or entity. Annabelle printed out her findings and locked them in her desk drawer. She was now convinced that she was looking at a sophisticated scheme to divert company funds. but she needed to be extremely careful about how she proceeded. Davidson's reaction to her initial inquiry had made it clear that bringing this to executive leadership was not an option. She decided her next step would be to identify who within the company had the authority and access to set up this type of payment arrangement. The accounts payable system required specific authorization codes for payments over $20,000, and there was a digital trail of who had approved each transaction. Working late one evening when most of the office was empty, Annabelle accessed the approval logs for the consulting payments. What she found was a pattern that implicated the highest levels of company leadership. The payments were being approved using Davidson's authorization code, but the digital signatures showed a pattern that suggested automated approval rather than individual review. Someone had set up the system to automatically approve these specific payments without Davidson having to manually sign off on each one. But there was something else in the logs that caught her attention. The original setup of the automated approval system had been done by someone with system administrator privileges, and the timestamp showed it had been configured outside of normal business hours on a weekend. Annabelle cross-referenced the timestamp with the company's security logs, which tracked badge access to the building. Only 3 people had been in the office that weekend: Davidson, CEO Richard Thornfield, and IT Director Kevin Walsh, who happened to be Janet's husband and someone Annabelle had known for years through company social events. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a case of suspicious consulting payments. It appeared to be a coordinated scheme involving multiple senior executives and possibly extending to the IT department. Annabelle realized she was in over her head. She needed advice from someone she trusted, but she also needed to be extremely careful about who she approached. The wrong conversation could not only end her career, but potentially put her in danger if the amounts of money involved were as significant as they appeared. She decided to reach out to her former college roommate, Lisa Chen, who had become a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud investigations. Lisa worked for a national accounting firm and had testified as an expert witness in several high-profile fraud cases. They met for coffee at a shop near downtown Denver, far from Pinnacle's offices. Annabelle had prepared a sanitized version of her findings, removing company names and specific details while preserving the essential patterns and relationships. "What you're describing sounds like a classic shell company scheme," Lisa said after reviewing Annabelle's documentation. "The sequential bank accounts, the Delaware incorporations, the automated approval system, these are all red flags that appear in textbook cases of corporate embezzlement." "How much money are we potentially talking about?" Annabelle asked. Lisa pulled out her calculator and ran some quick numbers. "If this has been going on for 2 years at the amounts you're describing, you're looking at close to $2 million. That's felony territory, and if it's a publicly traded company, you're also talking about securities fraud. What should I do?" "Honestly, you need to be very careful. Corporate fraud cases can get dangerous, especially when they involve this kind of money and senior executives. Your best bet is probably to document everything you can, make copies of all your evidence, and then find a way to get it to the authorities or the company's board of directors. The board doesn't meet for another 2 months. Then you might want to consider other options. The SEC has whistleblower protections, and they take these kinds of cases seriously. You could also reach out to the company's external auditors during their next review." Annabelle left the meeting with a clearer understanding of the seriousness of what she'd uncovered, but also with a growing sense of isolation. She was potentially the only person in the company who understood the full scope of what appeared to be a major fraud, and the perpetrators included the people she would normally report to. Over the next week, she began systematically documenting every aspect of her investigation. She created detailed timelines, copied supporting documentation, and even took photographs of her computer screen, showing the various databases and systems she'd accessed. She stored everything on a personal flash drive that she kept at home. Her caution proved to be well-founded. The following Monday, she arrived at work to find Kevin Walsh waiting at her desk. "Annabelle, I need to talk to you about your recent system access," Kevin said, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something more serious. "I've been reviewing our security logs, and I'm seeing some unusual activity on your account." Annabelle's heart rate increased, but she tried to maintain a calm exterior. "What kind of unusual activity?" You've been accessing databases and systems outside of your normal job responsibilities. Accounts payable logs, vendor management systems, things that aren't typically part of data analysis. I need to understand what you're working on that requires this kind of access. Annabelle realized that her investigation had triggered automated security alerts, and Kevin was either genuinely concerned about unauthorized access or was involved in the scheme and trying to determine how much she knew. I've been doing some analysis on consulting expenses, she said carefully. Janet asked me to look into some patterns in our spending, and I needed to trace the payments through various systems to understand the full picture. Kevin's expression didn't change, but Annabelle noticed he was taking notes on a small pad. Which consulting expenses specifically? Some regular payments that seemed to have unusual approval patterns. I was trying to understand how they were being processed. Have you discussed your findings with anyone outside the company? The question sent a chill through Annabelle. It was oddly specific and suggested that Kevin might know more about her investigation than he was letting on. No, of course not. This is internal company business. Good. I'm going to need you to document all the systems you've accessed and provide a summary of what you were looking for. Company policy requires that any system access outside of normal job functions be properly authorized and documented. After Kevin left, Annabelle sat at her desk, trying to process what had just happened. The timing of his inquiry, coming just days after her meeting with Lisa, seemed too coincidental. Either the company's security systems were more sophisticated than she'd realized, or someone was actively monitoring her activities. She decided to test a theory. Over the next few days, she made a point of accessing various systems for legitimate work purposes, creating a pattern of normal activity. She also began working on a decoy project, a genuine analysis of marketing expenses that would justify some of her recent system access. Her strategy seemed to work. Kevin didn't approach her again, and her access to company systems remained unchanged. But she noticed other subtle changes in her work environment. Conversations seemed to quiet when she approached groups of colleagues, and she got the sense that people were watching her more carefully. At a comma, the paranoia was probably justified. During a routine conversation with Janet about quarterly reporting deadlines, Janet mentioned that she'd been asked by senior leadership to provide a list of all the projects Annabelle was currently working on. They said it was for resource planning purposes, Janet explained. But the timing seemed odd. Is there anything unusual going on that I should know about? Annabelle faced a difficult decision. Janet had always been supportive and trustworthy, but she was also married to Kevin, who was now actively monitoring Annabelle's system access. Bringing Janet into her investigation could put her in an impossible position between her loyalty to Annabelle and her marriage. I've been doing some analysis that's raised questions about certain expense patterns, Annabelle said carefully. Nothing dramatic, but it's possible that senior leadership is concerned about the scope of my investigation. Janet frowned. What kind of expense patterns? Annabelle made a split-second decision to trust her supervisor. Regular payments to consulting firms that don't seem to have proper documentation or deliverables. When I brought it to Davidson's attention, he told me to drop the investigation, but the patterns are too suspicious to ignore. How suspicious? Potentially fraudulent. Janet was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the manufacturing facility. Finally, she turned back to Annabelle with a serious expression. If you're right about this, you're in a very dangerous position. Corporate fraud investigations can destroy careers, and if you're wrong, you'll be the one who pays the price. But if you're right and you do nothing, you could be seen as complicit. What would you do? I'd make sure I had solid evidence, and then I'd find a way to get it to someone who could act on it without destroying my career in the process. The board of directors, the external auditors, maybe even law enforcement, if the evidence is strong enough. That evening, Annabelle reviewed all her documentation one more time. She had payment records, incorporation documents, bank routing information, approval logs, and timeline analysis. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, and the pattern was clear enough that any competent investigator would recognize it as potential fraud. She also realized that her window of opportunity was probably closing. Kevin's inquiry about her system access suggested that her investigation had been detected, and it was only a matter of time before her access was restricted or her activities were more closely monitored. The next morning, she made copies of all her evidence and mailed one set to her home address using the company's outgoing mail system. She figured that if anything happened to her original files, she would have a backup that couldn't be traced to her personal activities. She was walking back from the mailroom when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two executives were talking near the elevator, and while she couldn't see who they were, she could hear their voices clearly. "The board meeting is in 6 weeks, one voice said. "We need to make sure everything is clean before then." "What about the analyst who's been asking questions?" "Davidson thinks he handled it, but I'm not convinced. Kevin says she's still poking around in systems she shouldn't be accessing. Maybe it's time for a more direct approach." Annabelle pressed herself against the wall, hoping they wouldn't see her as they continued their conversation. "We can't do anything too obvious. She's been here for years, and Janet speaks highly of her work. But there are ways to handle problems like this. Transfer her to a different department? Eliminate her position? Or create performance issues that justify termination. Kevin can document unauthorized system access, and we can build a case that she's not meeting her responsibilities." The elevator arrived, and the voices faded as the doors closed. Annabelle stood in the hallway, her hands shaking as she realized that her investigation had not only been detected, but was now being actively countered by the very people she suspected of fraud. She had perhaps days or weeks before they found a way to remove her from the company and eliminate her access to the evidence she'd been gathering. If she was going to act, it had to be soon. That afternoon, she began researching the company's board of directors, looking for someone who might be independent enough to investigate her concerns without alerting the executives she suspected. Pinnacle's board included several outside directors who had reputations for integrity and independence. One name stood out: Margaret Sullivan, a retired federal prosecutor who had joined the board 2 years earlier. Sullivan had built her career prosecuting white-collar crime and had a reputation for being thorough and fearless. If anyone on the board would take fraud allegations seriously, it would be her. Annabelle spent the evening crafting a careful letter to Sullivan, summarizing her findings and including copies of the most compelling evidence. She was careful to present the information as suspicious patterns that warranted investigation rather than definitive proof of fraud. The next morning, she mailed the letter to Sullivan's law firm, marked confidential and personal. She also prepared a second package with copies of all her evidence, which she planned to send to the company's external auditing firm. But as she was preparing to leave for lunch, Kevin Walsh appeared at her desk again, this time with a security guard she didn't recognize. "Annabelle, I need you to come with me to the conference room. We need to discuss some serious concerns about your recent activities." The conference room felt smaller than usual, with Kevin Walsh, the security guard, and HR Director Carol Peterson, all staring at Annabelle across the polished oak table. Carol had arrived just moments after Kevin's initial request, carrying a thick folder that suggested this meeting had been planned well in advance. "Annabelle, we need to address some serious concerns about unauthorized system access and potential violation of company data security policies," Carol began, opening her folder with deliberate precision. "Kevin has documented multiple instances of you accessing systems and databases outside the scope of your authorized responsibilities." Annabelle's mind raced as she tried to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal the full extent of her investigation. "I was conducting an analysis requested by my supervisor. All of my system access has been in support of legitimate business purposes." Kevin slid a printed report across the table. "This shows over 40 instances in the past 3 weeks, where you accessed accounts, payable logs, vendor databases, and administrative systems that aren't part of your normal job functions. Some of these accesses occurred outside of business hours. I often work late to avoid system slowdowns during peak hours. And as I explained before, I was tracing consulting expenses as part of an analysis project." Carol leaned forward, her expression stern but not unsympathetic. "Annabelle, you've been a valued employee here for 4 years. Your performance reviews have been consistently excellent, and Janet speaks very highly of your work. That's why we want to give you an opportunity to explain what's really going on." The phrasing struck Annabelle as ominous. This wasn't a routine policy discussion. It was an interrogation designed to determine how much she knew and what she planned to do with that knowledge. "I appreciate that, Carol, but I'm not sure what you're looking for beyond what I've already explained. I was asked to analyze expense patterns, and I did exactly that." Kevin opened his own folder, revealing printouts that made Annabelle's heart sink. "We also have logs showing that you accessed our incorporation documents, banking information, and even attempted to trace wire transfers to external accounts. These activities go far beyond expense analysis." They had been monitoring her activities more closely than she'd realized. Every database query, every search, every system access had been logged and analyzed. She was sitting in front of people who knew exactly what she'd discovered, and were now trying to determine whether she posed a threat to their operation. "Furthermore," Carol continued, "we have reason to believe you may have discussed confidential company information with external parties. This is a serious violation of your employment agreement and could result in immediate termination." Annabelle felt a chill of fear. They knew about her meeting with Lisa Chen, which meant they were either monitoring her activities outside of work or had access to information that should have been private. The level of surveillance suggested resources and connections that went beyond what she would expect from a routine corporate security investigation. "I haven't discussed confidential company information with anyone outside the organization," she said, technically truthful since she'd sanitized her conversation with Lisa. "What about your recent correspondence with external parties?" Kevin asked, consulting another document. "Our mail monitoring systems have flagged outgoing correspondence that may contain sensitive company information." The mention of mail monitoring sent a wave of panic through Annabelle. If they were intercepting outgoing mail, they might have her letter to Margaret Sullivan. She tried to maintain her composure while her mind frantically calculated how much trouble she was in. "I'm not aware of any inappropriate correspondence," she said carefully. Carol and Kevin exchanged a look that suggested they had more information than they were revealing. Carol closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. "Annabelle, let me be direct with you. We have evidence of unauthorized system access, potential theft of confidential information, and communications with external parties that may constitute corporate espionage. These are terminable offenses that could also result in criminal charges." The accusation of corporate espionage was so absurd that Annabelle almost laughed, but the seriousness of Carol's expressions stopped her. They were building a case to destroy her credibility and eliminate her as a threat, using her own investigation as evidence of wrongdoing. "However," Carol continued, "given your previously excellent record, we're prepared to offer you an alternative. You can resign immediately with a severance package and confidentiality agreement, or we can proceed with a formal investigation that will likely result in termination for cause and potential legal action." The ultimatum was clear. Accept the severance and sign away her right to discuss what she discovered, or face a coordinated campaign to destroy her professionally and possibly criminally. It was a sophisticated approach that would eliminate her as a threat while making her complicit in covering up the fraud. "I need time to consider this," Annabelle said. "Unfortunately, this offer is only available today," Carol replied. "The evidence we have requires immediate action, and we can't allow potential security risks to continue." Kevin added, "Your system access has already been suspended pending resolution of this matter. You won't be able to return to your workstation until this is resolved." They were forcing her into a corner, demanding an immediate decision before she could consult with anyone or fully understand her options. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to prevent careful consideration of the consequences. Annabelle realized that regardless of what she decided in this room, her time at Pinnacle Industries was over. The question was whether she would leave quietly with a severance package or be terminated in a way that destroyed her reputation and potentially exposed her to legal liability. "What would the confidentiality agreement cover?" she asked. Carol smiled for the first time during the meeting. "Standard language prohibiting discussion of proprietary business information, client relationships, internal processes, and financial data. Nothing unreasonable." The vague language would likely prohibit her from discussing anything she'd discovered about the fraudulent consulting payments. It was a comprehensive gag order disguised as a routine confidentiality agreement, and if I don't sign, then we proceed with the investigation, and you'll likely face termination without severance, potential civil liability for unauthorized access to company systems, and possible criminal referral for corporate espionage. The threats were escalating, designed to make the severance package seem like the only reasonable option. But Annabelle realized that accepting would make her complicit in covering up what appeared to be a multi-million-dollar fraud. "I'd like to speak with my supervisor before making this decision." Kevin shook his head. "Janet is aware of the situation, but this decision needs to be made by you alone. Including additional people in this discussion would constitute a further breach of confidentiality." They were isolating her from anyone who might provide support or alternative perspectives. Every aspect of this meeting was designed to pressure her into accepting their terms, without fully considering the implications. "I need to use the restroom," Annabelle said, standing up from the table. "I'll escort you," the security guard said, speaking for the first time during the meeting. As they walked down the hallway, Annabelle's mind raced through her options. She could accept the severance and hope that her letter to Margaret Sullivan had gotten through before being detected. She could refuse and face whatever consequences they were threatening. Or she could try to find a third option that protected her while ensuring the fraud was exposed. The security guard waited outside the restroom door, confirming that she was essentially under house arrest until she agreed to their terms. When she returned to the conference room, Carol and Kevin were reviewing additional documents that appeared to contain more evidence of her investigative activities. "Have you made your decision?" Carol asked. Annabelle sat down and looked directly at Kevin. "Before I decide anything, I want to understand something. The consulting payments I was investigating, Strategic Dynamics, Pinnacle Advisory Services, and Mountain Peak Consulting. Can you explain what services these firms provide to justify nearly $2 million in payments over 2 years?" Kevin's expression didn't change, but she noticed his jaw tighten slightly. "Those are legitimate business relationships that don't concern your job responsibilities." "Really?" "Because I couldn't find any contracts, any deliverables, any work product, or even any evidence that these companies exist beyond shell incorporations in Delaware and Nevada. The bank accounts are sequential numbers at the same small regional bank, and the payments are structured to avoid board oversight. That's not a legitimate business relationship. That's a textbook fraud scheme." The room fell silent. Carol and Kevin exchanged another look, and this time Annabelle could see concern in their expressions. She had just demonstrated that she understood the full scope of what she'd discovered and wasn't going to be intimidated into silence. Carol recovered first. "Those are serious accusations based on incomplete information and unauthorized investigation. Making such claims without proper evidence could constitute defamation. The evidence is quite complete, actually. And I've documented everything thoroughly, including the automated approval system that Kevin set up to process these payments without individual review. I also have evidence showing that these payments began shortly after CFO Davidson joined the company, despite his claims that they predated his tenure." Kevin leaned forward, his friendly demeanor completely gone. "You're way over your head, Annabelle. You don't understand the complexities of corporate finance or the legitimate reasons for confidential business arrangements. I understand fraudulent shell companies and money laundering schemes. And I understand that this conversation is being recorded, so everything you've just said is now documented." Annabelle had no idea whether the room was actually being recorded, but her statement had the desired effect. Both Carol and Kevin looked uncertain, and the security guard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Carol stood up abruptly. "This meeting is over. Kevin, please escort Annabelle to collect her personal belongings. Her employment is terminated effective immediately." "For what cause?" Annabelle asked. "Unauthorized system access, violation of confidentiality policies, and insubordination." As she was escorted to her desk to collect her belongings, Annabelle noticed that several of her colleagues were watching the proceedings with obvious concern. Janet emerged from her office as the security guard supervised Annabelle's packing of personal items. "What's happening?" Janet asked, looking directly at the security guard. "Ms. Martinez's employment has been terminated for policy violations," the guard replied tersely. Janet looked at Annabelle with an expression that conveyed both sympathy and understanding. "I'm sorry this happened. Your work here has always been exemplary." Annabelle realized that Janet was trying to communicate something without being explicit. The emphasis on work suggested that Janet understood the real reason for her termination and supported her investigation. As she packed her belongings, Annabelle made sure to remove the flash drive she kept hidden in her desk drawer. All of her evidence was backed up at home, but she wanted to ensure that no traces remained in the office that could be used against her. The security guard escorted her to the parking lot, watching as she got into her car and drove away. As she pulled out of the Pinnacle Industries parking lot for what she knew would be the last time, Annabelle felt a mixture of fear and determination. She had lost her job, but she had also forced them to show their hand. The aggressive response to her investigation confirmed that she had uncovered something significant, and their desperate attempt to silence her suggested that the fraud was even larger than she had initially suspected. That evening, she received a call from an unknown number. "Ms. Martinez, this is Margaret Sullivan. I received your letter regarding financial irregularities at Pinnacle Industries. I think we need to talk." The relief Annabelle felt was overwhelming. Her letter had gotten through before being detected, and she now had an ally on the board of directors who had the authority and credibility to investigate her claims. "Thank you for calling, Ms. Sullivan. I was terminated today for investigating the payments I described in my letter." "That's interesting timing. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I have some questions about your findings, and there are some things about Pinnacle's recent financial reports that your letter has helped clarify." After hanging up, Annabelle realized that her investigation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The termination had freed her from the constraints of being an employee, and now she had an ally with real power within the company. But as she prepared for her meeting with Margaret Sullivan, she couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin Walsh's parting words had been more than just empty threats. She had made powerful enemies, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to use surveillance and intimidation to protect their scheme. The next phase of this battle would be fought on a much larger stage, with much higher stakes. And Annabelle was no longer just a data analyst who had stumbled onto suspicious expense patterns. She was now a whistleblower with evidence of corporate fraud, and that made her both valuable and dangerous to very powerful people. Margaret Sullivan's law office occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown Denver building with panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains. Annabelle had arrived 30 minutes early, using the extra time to review her evidence one final time and prepare for what she knew would be the most important conversation of her career. Sullivan emerged from the elevator at exactly 9 o'clock, a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Her reputation as a former federal prosecutor was evident in the way she carried herself: direct, analytical, and slightly intimidating. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming. I've reviewed your letter several times, and I have to say, your findings raise some very serious concerns." They settled into Sullivan's conference room, where Annabelle spread out the comprehensive documentation she had prepared. Sullivan examined each piece of evidence with the methodical attention of someone trained to build legal cases. "Walk me through your timeline one more time," Sullivan said, making notes on a legal pad. "When did you first notice these payment patterns?" Annabelle recounted her investigation from the beginning, but this time with the benefit of hindsight and additional context from her termination. Sullivan asked pointed questions about methodology, documentation, and potential alternative explanations for the patterns. "You mentioned that CFO Davidson claimed these arrangements predated his tenure at the company. Do you have documentation proving otherwise?" Annabelle pulled out the employee directory pages and payment records. Davidson started at Pinnacle on March 15, 2023. The first payment to Strategic Dynamics was processed on June 18, 2023. The timeline is unambiguous. Sullivan studied the documents, then looked up with a grim expression. This suggests deliberate deception rather than simple oversight. A CFO would certainly remember establishing new consulting relationships worth nearly $1 million annually. There's something else, Annabelle said, hesitating before revealing information she hadn't included in her original letter. During my termination meeting yesterday, they demonstrated knowledge of my activities that suggests sophisticated surveillance. They knew about system accesses, external communications, even mail monitoring. The level of oversight suggests this goes beyond a simple fraud scheme. What do you mean? If someone was just stealing money through fake consulting payments, they wouldn't need to monitor employees this extensively. The surveillance infrastructure suggests they're protecting something much larger, or they're concerned about exposure at a much higher level. Sullivan was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the evidence and making additional notes. Finally, she looked up with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal determination. Annabelle, I need to tell you something that your letter helped me understand. For the past 6 months, I've been questioning some of the financial reports presented to the board. Nothing dramatic, but there were expense categories that seemed disproportionate to the business activity I was seeing in board meetings. What kind of expenses? Professional services, consulting fees, administrative costs, all within reasonable ranges individually, but collectively representing a significant portion of our operational budget. When I asked for more detailed breakdowns, I was told that the information was commercially sensitive and that detailed disclosure could harm competitive positioning. Annabelle felt a surge of validation. They've been hiding the fraudulent payments within legitimate expense categories to avoid board scrutiny. It appears so. And if you're right about the amounts involved, we're looking at material misrepresentation to shareholders and potentially to our external auditors. Sullivan stood and walked to the window overlooking downtown Denver. I've been on corporate boards for 15 years, and I've seen various types of financial irregularities. But what you've documented suggests a level of sophistication and coordination that's extremely troubling. What's our next step? Sullivan turned back to face Annabelle. First, I need to understand who else might be involved. Your evidence implicates Davidson and potentially Thornfield, but the IT infrastructure suggests additional participants. Second, we need to determine the full scope of the financial impact. And third, we need to decide how to proceed without alerting the perpetrators that their scheme has been exposed. They already know I was investigating. My termination yesterday probably triggered emergency protocols, which means we have a limited window before they either destroy evidence or find ways to legitimize the payments retroactively. Corporate fraud schemes often include contingency plans for exactly this type of exposure. Sullivan returned to her desk and began making notes on a new legal pad. I'm going to contact our external auditing firm and request an emergency review of the specific expense categories you've identified. I'm also going to reach out to 2 other independent board members who I trust completely. What about the risk that word will get back to Thornfield or Davidson? There's always that risk. But at this point, we have an obligation to investigate. If we're right about the fraud, every day we delay represents additional theft of shareholder assets. If we're wrong, then we'll have conducted a thorough review that confirms the integrity of our financial systems. Over the next hour, Sullivan and Annabelle developed a comprehensive investigation strategy. Sullivan would use her authority as a board member to request detailed financial records and initiate an independent audit. Annabelle would continue analyzing the evidence she had already gathered and would be available to provide testimony or additional analysis as needed. There's one more thing, Sullivan said as they prepared to conclude the meeting. Your termination yesterday creates both risks and opportunities. The risk is obvious. They've eliminated your access to internal systems and may be building a case to discredit your credibility. But the opportunity is that you're now free to cooperate with external investigators without employment-related constraints. External investigators? If this is as serious as it appears, we may need to involve federal authorities. Corporate fraud of this magnitude falls under SEC jurisdiction, and the interstate nature of the payments could trigger FBI involvement. The mention of federal authorities made the situation feel suddenly more real and more dangerous. Annabelle had begun her investigation as a routine data analysis project, and now she was potentially looking at becoming a federal witness in a major corporate fraud case. What kind of protection would I have as a whistleblower? Significant legal protections, but also significant risks. Whistleblowers in major corporate fraud cases often face retaliation, legal challenges, and sometimes physical threats. The financial stakes involved here could motivate very aggressive responses. As Annabelle left Sullivan's office, she felt both energized and terrified. She now had a powerful ally with the authority to investigate her claims, but she was also beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had uncovered and the potential consequences of pursuing it. That afternoon, she received a call from Janet Walsh. "Annabelle, I heard about what happened yesterday. I'm so sorry. This is completely unfair." "Thank you, Janet. I appreciate that. Listen, I can't talk long, but there are some things you should know. After you left yesterday, there was a lot of activity on the executive floor. People going in and out of offices, hushed conversations, that kind of thing. And this morning, Kevin asked me for a list of all the projects you worked on over the past year. Did you give it to him?" "I gave him the official project list, but I didn't mention your recent analysis work. I figured if he wanted to know about that, he could ask directly." Janet was protecting her, even at potential risk to her own position. "Janet, you need to be careful. If they're willing to terminate me for asking questions, they might retaliate against anyone who supported my work. I've been thinking about that. Kevin and I have been married for 12 years, and I've never seen him this stressed about work. He's been getting calls at home, working late, and he seems genuinely worried about something. I think whatever you uncovered has a lot of people very concerned." "Has he said anything specific about the investigation?" "Not directly, but I overheard a phone conversation last night where he was talking about, quote, damage control and, quote, limiting exposure. It sounded like he was coordinating with other people on some kind of response plan." This confirmed Annabelle's suspicion that her termination had triggered emergency protocols within the fraud scheme. They were now actively working to protect themselves and minimize the damage from her investigation. "Janet, I need to ask you something, and I understand if you can't or won't answer. Do you think Kevin is involved in something unethical?" There was a long pause before Janet responded. "Honestly? Yes. I don't know what or how, but his behavior over the past few months has been completely out of character. The stress, the secrecy, the defensive reactions when I ask about work, it's like he's protecting something he knows is wrong. What are you gonna do?" "I don't know. He's my husband, but I also have my own professional integrity to consider. If he's involved in something that could hurt the company or other employees, I can't just ignore that." After ending the call with Janet, Annabelle realized that the fraud scheme was beginning to fracture under the pressure of exposure. Kevin's stress and defensive behavior suggested that the participants were not professional criminals accustomed to covering their tracks under pressure. That evening, Margaret Sullivan called with an update on her initial inquiries. "I spoke with Harrison and Associates, our external auditing firm. They're very concerned about the patterns you've identified and have agreed to conduct an immediate review of the expense categories in question. They'll begin their investigation tomorrow morning." "How long will that take?" "They estimate 3 to 5 days for a preliminary assessment, assuming they have full cooperation from company management. If they encounter resistance or missing documentation, it could take longer." "What kind of resistance?" "Claims that certain records are privileged, unavailable, or require additional authorization to access. Standard delay tactics used when people are trying to hide something or buy time to create alternative explanations." Sullivan paused, and Annabelle could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I also spoke with 2 other board members, Thomas Rodriguez and Dr. Sarah Kim. Both are independent directors with no business relationships with Pinnacle beyond their board service. I briefed them on your findings, and they're equally concerned." "What's the next step?" "We're calling an emergency board meeting for this Friday. Thornfield won't be able to prevent it because we have enough independent directors to force the meeting. We'll be requesting a full presentation of the consulting expenses you've identified, along with documentation of services rendered and authorization approvals." "Will Davidson be present?" "He'll have to be. The CFO can't avoid a board meeting about financial irregularities. But his presence will also give us an opportunity to ask direct questions about the discrepancies you've identified. What if they've had time to create false documentation or cover stories?" "That's a risk, but creating false documentation after the fact is a separate crime, and experienced auditors are trained to detect recently created or backdated records. If they try to cover up the original fraud with additional deception, they'll likely make their situation worse." Friday's board meeting would be the crucial test of whether Annabelle's investigation would lead to exposure and accountability, or whether the executives would successfully defend their scheme. Everything depended on the quality of her evidence and the board's willingness to pursue difficult questions, despite potential pressure from company leadership. As she prepared for what would likely be the most important week of her professional life, Annabelle reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed. A month ago, she had been a quiet data analyst doing routine expense analysis. Now she was a whistleblower whose investigation could potentially bring down the senior leadership of a publicly traded company. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Martinez? This is Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. I understand you may have information about financial irregularities at Pinnacle Industries. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your findings. Special Agent Rebecca Torres met Annabelle at a quiet coffee shop in Boulder, 30 miles from Pinnacle's Denver offices. Torres was a compact woman with sharp eyes and the measured speech patterns of someone who spent her career building legal cases that had to withstand courtroom scrutiny. Ms. Martinez, we've been monitoring some unusual financial activity related to several corporations, including Pinnacle Industries. Your situation has come to our attention through multiple channels. Annabelle's surprise must have shown on her face because Torres continued. The SEC flagged some of Pinnacle's expense reporting patterns 6 months ago as part of a broader investigation into shell company fraud. Your termination and subsequent contact with board members created additional data points that triggered our interest. So you already knew about the fraudulent consulting payments? We suspected irregularities, but we lacked the internal documentation needed to build a case. Your evidence provides the missing pieces that could make prosecution viable. Torres opened a briefcase and removed a digital recorder. With your permission, I'd like to record our conversation. You're not under investigation, but your testimony could be crucial in pursuing charges against others. Over the next 2 hours, Annabelle walked Torres through every aspect of her investigation. The FBI agent asked detailed questions about methodology, timeline, and the specific evidence that supported each conclusion. She was particularly interested in the automated approval system and Kevin Walsh's role in setting it up. Based on what you're describing, we're looking at potential charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud. If the amounts reach the thresholds you've calculated, we're talking about significant federal prison time for anyone involved. What happens next? We coordinate with the SEC and work with Pinnacle's board to ensure the Friday meeting proceeds without interference. Your board allies don't know this yet, but we'll have agents positioned nearby in case there are attempts to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. Friday morning arrived with unexpected drama. Annabelle received a call from Margaret Sullivan at 7 a.m., her voice tense with urgency. The meeting has been moved up to 10 a.m., and Thornfield is claiming that the expense review has already been completed by an independent consultant who found no irregularities. He's presenting this as a routine audit that has already resolved any concerns. That's impossible. Any legitimate review would take weeks, not days. Exactly. We think they're trying to present fabricated results to close the investigation before it really begins. Can you be at the office by 9:30? We may need you to testify remotely about your findings. The Pinnacle Industries boardroom had never felt more charged with tension. Through a video conference link arranged by Sullivan, Annabelle could see the faces of the board members and executives she had worked with for 4 years. CEO Richard Thornfield sat at the head of the table, projecting confidence despite the circumstances. CFO Michael Davidson looked visibly uncomfortable, constantly adjusting his tie and avoiding eye contact with the board members. Before we begin, Thornfield announced, I want to address the concerns that have been raised about our consulting expenses. We take any allegations of financial irregularities extremely seriously, which is why we immediately commissioned an independent review by Apex Business Solutions. He slid a bound report across the table to each board member. This comprehensive analysis confirms that all consulting payments have been properly authorized, documented, and delivered. The payments in question represent legitimate strategic advisory services that have provided significant value to our international expansion efforts. Margaret Sullivan opened the report and quickly scanned the first few pages. Richard, This report is dated yesterday, but it claims to represent a 6-week comprehensive review. How is that possible? Apex has been conducting ongoing compliance monitoring for us as part of our regular audit procedures. When concerns were raised, they simply compiled their existing analysis into a formal report. Dr. Sarah Kim, one of the independent board members Sullivan had briefed, raised her hand. I'd like to hear directly from the analyst who originally identified these patterns. Ms. Martinez should be given an opportunity to present her findings before we accept any conclusions. Davidson spoke for the first time. Ms. Martinez was terminated for unauthorized access to confidential systems and violation of company policies. Her analysis was conducted improperly, and her conclusions are unreliable. Nevertheless, Thomas Rodriguez interjected, if we're going to evaluate the validity of this Apex report, we need to understand the specific concerns that triggered this investigation. Sullivan activated the video conference link, and Annabelle found herself looking at the faces of Pinnacle's leadership for the first time since her termination. The hostility from Thornfield and Davidson was palpable, even through the video connection. Ms. Martinez, please summarize your findings regarding the consulting payments to Strategic Dynamics, Pinnacle Advisory Services, and Mountain Peak Consulting. Annabelle had prepared for this moment, and she delivered her analysis with calm precision. She explained the payment patterns, the lack of documentation, the sequential bank accounts, the shell company incorporations, and the timeline that contradicted Davidson's claims about when the arrangements began. Furthermore, she concluded, the Apex Business Solutions report you're reviewing was itself commissioned from a firm that didn't exist until last week. Apex was incorporated in Delaware on Monday, 3 days before allegedly completing a 6-week review. The boardroom fell silent. Thornfield's confident expression faltered, and Davidson appeared to be on the verge of panic. Sullivan looked directly at the camera. Ms. Martinez, how do you know when Apex Business Solutions was incorporated? I've been working with federal investigators who have access to real-time corporate registration databases. Special Agent Torres is actually positioned outside this building right now, along with SEC investigators and a federal warrant to seize financial records related to this investigation. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Davidson stood abruptly, his chair falling backward. This is a setup. We're being ambushed by a disgruntled former employee who's fabricated evidence to support wild conspiracy theories. Thornfield tried to maintain control. Everyone needs to calm down. We'll cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation, but we won't be intimidated by theatrical accusations. Margaret Sullivan stood and walked to the boardroom door. Richard, I think it's time for you to meet with the federal agents who are here to discuss this situation with you directly. What followed unfolded with the swift efficiency of a well-coordinated law enforcement operation. FBI agents entered the boardroom and served warrants for the immediate seizure of financial records, computer systems, and communication devices. Thornfield and Davidson were read their rights and escorted from the building in handcuffs. Kevin Walsh was arrested at his desk in the IT department, where agents found him attempting to delete files from the company's financial systems. The evidence of obstruction of justice would later prove to be almost as damaging as the original fraud charges. 3 months later, Annabelle sat in a federal courthouse in Denver, watching as the 3 executives who had tried to destroy her career were sentenced for their crimes. The investigation had ultimately uncovered over $3 million in fraudulent payments, far exceeding her original estimates. Davidson received 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering. Kevin Walsh got 4 years for his role in facilitating the scheme and attempting to destroy evidence. Thornfield, as the mastermind of the operation, was sentenced to 12 years and ordered to pay full restitution to Pinnacle Industries. The shell companies had been funneling money to offshore accounts controlled by Thornfield, with Davidson and Walsh receiving significant kickbacks for their participation. The scheme had been designed to continue indefinitely, gradually draining company resources while enriching the executives at the expense of shareholders and employees. Margaret Sullivan was elected as Pinnacle's interim CEO, and one of her first actions was to offer Annabelle a position as Director of Financial Analysis and Compliance, a role specifically created to prevent future fraud. The salary was double what she had been making as a data analyst. You know, Sullivan said during Annabelle's first day in her new office, When you first sent me that letter, I thought we were looking at maybe some sloppy bookkeeping or minor policy violations. I never imagined we'd uncover a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Annabelle looked out her new window, which overlooked the same parking lot she used to watch from her cubicle. I just followed the numbers. The data told a story, and I kept listening until I understood what it was saying. Your metrics weren't useless after all. No, Annabelle smiled. They turned out to be exactly what the company needed. 6 months later, Annabelle received the SEC's Whistleblower Award, a check for $450,000, representing her percentage of the recovered funds. But more importantly, she had helped establish new protocols at Pinnacle that would prevent similar fraud schemes and protect future whistleblowers who had the courage to ask difficult questions. The executives who had called her metrics, quote, useless, were now serving federal prison sentences, brought down by the very analysis they had tried to suppress. And Annabelle Martinez, once a quiet data analyst in a corner cubicle, had become one of the most respected compliance officers in Colorado's corporate community. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from the people who are willing to look closely at numbers that don't add up, ask questions that make others uncomfortable, and pursue the truth even when powerful people try to silence them. Annabelle's story proved that in the world of corporate finance, the most dangerous person to a fraud scheme isn't a federal investigator or a board member. It's an analyst who knows how to read the data and has the courage to act on what she finds. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.